You're listening to Release Your Resistance with Bex Beltran, episode 41. Welcome to Release Your Resistance. This is Bex. The only reason why any of us don't have what we want in life is because of our own resistance. Right now, I'm learning how to recognize and release my resistance, and this podcast tells you how you can release your resistance so that you can live the exact life that you want. Let's get started. We all know that comparison is the thief of joy, and I still stand by that. But lately, I've been thinking about another comparison theory too. I've been wondering, why do we compare ourselves? And is there ever an upside to comparison? Remember the compare and contrast assignments in English class? In this kind of essay, compare means find the similarities, and contrast means find the differences. That doesn't sound so bad. Finding similarities and differences just sounds like noticing things, being aware of things, getting more insight and perspective. According to Lumen Learning, those assignments we did back in school were not meant for us to state the obvious, but actually to help us to illuminate subtle differences or unexpected similarities between two subjects. So, if a writing assignment can train our brains to illuminate subtleties and find the unexpected, could a thought assignment help us the same way in our day-to-day lives? And noticing that this writing assignment and now this thought assignment is illuminating and uncovering makes me think that comparison isn't a problem at all. It isn't negative on its own. To say X is bigger than Y is actually neutral. The reason why we might think comparison is a problem or a thief is because of what comes after we make the comparison. What if that expression that we love and live by, comparison is the thief of joy, is helpful part of the time, but not the complete explanation of what comparison really does for us? And since maybe because of that expression, comparison does have a negative connotation, do we need a new word for the positive kind of comparing? I don't think so. I think we are smart enough to train our brains to compare in a helpful way and decide what to do with any unhelpful comparisons. Another famous expression you may have heard is, simplicity is the purest form of sophistication. So let's keep it simple. Let's just reclaim comparison. Why do we compare ourselves? What's the psychological reason? Well, Dr. Leon Festinger, a social psychologist from the 40s and 50s, who is maybe best known for my favorite psychological phenomenon, cognitive dissonance, also explained that human beings cannot actually define themselves intrinsically or independently. We can only define ourselves in relation to someone else. That's why we compare. Dr. Festinger's social comparison theory tells us that we have a drive to evaluate our opinions and our abilities accurately, and that when there's no physical standard present, we evaluate ourselves by comparison with other people. In the past 60 years or so, so much more research has been done about social comparison. And it's more complex than I need to get into on this episode, but I bring this up to point out that there are psychologically helpful reasons for comparison. Before we get into those, let's talk about how we might be more familiar with comparison. Have you heard the phrase, compare and despair, implying that when you compare, you'll despair? After all, comparison is stealing your joy, right? Why is it compare and despair? It's when we compare in generalities, not specifics. It's when our mind exaggerates against our favor and we believe it. To use a well-known metaphor, it's when we compare apples and oranges and subconsciously believe that because it's all fruit, it's a valid comparison. It's when we aren't using comparison in a helpful way. And the really despair part of comparison is what comes after it. For example, let's think of some comparison statements that we might hear or even say. He's so much smarter than me. She has more friends than I do. Their podcast is doing so much better than mine is. She looks younger than me even though she's older than me. He always gets more attention than I do. Those statements by themselves, if true, which I suspect that they are not necessarily, are harmless on their own. They don't sound harmless, they sound harmful because we all probably know what we would make them mean if they were true for us. But consider that we could use the same sentence structure and make them less personal and less familiar, and we can see, yeah, they're just comparison statements. No problem at all. Like, dolphins are so much smarter than lobsters. Or, the Beatles had more fans than New Kids on the Block. And House A has more bedrooms than House B. This recipe has fewer calories even though it's a bigger serving size. Summer temperatures are always higher than winter temperatures. By the way, I am not saying any of the statements in either set of examples that I just gave you are true or accurate or provable. I'm just pointing out how when we remove the personal elements from a comparison, it doesn't really sound that bad. We probably don't have any emotional attachment to the second set of comparison statements. So the real problem, the real harm with comparison comes when we add a second thought after we make the comparison. You know what I'm talking about? The so statement. Maybe something like, he's smarter than me, so that means I'll never be as successful. Or, she has more friends than I do, so it's easier for her to have an amazing life. Or, their podcast is doing better than mine, so I must be doing something wrong. Noticing the so statement, this additional meaning proves to me that it's not the comparing that's the thief of joy. It's the meaning we assign to the comparison, especially a sloppy, unreliable, exaggerated comparison. No wonder there's despair when we compare. So let's reclaim the action of comparing and rephrase it to compare and aware. Compare with specifics. Make a fair comparison with actual numbers or times and measurable facts. And then get curious about what's causing the difference. So for the example of their podcast is doing better than mine, so I must be doing something wrong, what defines doing better? Is it the number of downloads? Is it the number of reviews? The number of comments on social media posts? If I start comparing actual specific data, then I can decide if those metrics are important to me, if they're in line with my own goals, and if I want to do something to change those numbers. Instead of saying they're doing better, I can notice that I think that because I see that they have a higher number of reviews on their podcast than I have, I think they're better. Do I care about reviews? Is a specific number of reviews important to my goals for my podcast? If so, I can figure out a strategy to get more reviews. Maybe even by noticing how they ask their listeners for reviews. But if I realize that reviews don't really matter to me and aren't really part of my goals, then instead of thinking that they're doing better because of their reviews and that I'm doing something wrong because of my reviews, I can just notice, they have 12 more reviews than I do, and their podcast started 4 months before mine started. Interesting. No need for despair. A second way to compare and be aware is to check your brain for exaggeration during comparison and insist on facts instead, or at least acknowledge what you cannot possibly know for sure. For the example of the comparison that she has more friends than I do, so it's easier for her to have an amazing life. First of all, notice the tone. Like, really? Okay. But what do I mean when I say friends? Like, friends in real life? How am I defining a friend? Does it include all the people that she knows? Does it include people she spends time with? Including or excluding family members? How much time do they have to spend to be a friend? How frequently do they have to spend time together? And when I say her life is amazing, what do I mean by that? Is it more fun? How am I measuring fun? Is it more interesting? How do I know if her life is interesting? Do I mean, well, her life is more meaningful than mine? How would I possibly know if someone else's life is more meaningful than my life is? And of course, just stating all these questions and thoughts demonstrates how unknowable all of this information is. So my brain is just exaggerating and believing things as facts that are actually unknowable and also not relevant to me. So again, no need for despair. The third way you can compare and be aware is be systematic and scientific when you decide to compare. If you're comparing your business to someone who you look up to, try to find where she was at your current stage. Can you find her 5th blog post when you've just posted your 5th blog post? How do those two compare? Can you figure out how many clients she was working with at the 1-year mark if you're currently at the 1-year mark? And if we're going to be completely scientific, we would also need to control for the rest of the variables. So the only difference would be you and the other business owner, and every other element would need to be identical for a true comparison. And of course, we can't do that. We can't go back in time and put you both at the same starting point. The closest you can get is to try to compare your current self to her approximate same version at your current stage. That's a long way of saying, don't compare the beginner you to the tenured other person. And all of this is to say, when we do decide to compare on purpose, let's only keep the helpful comparison methods and ignore the unhelpful ones. Let's be very intentional about what we make a comparison mean. And just to recap, we know and agree and remind ourselves that comparison is the thief of joy when we're doing it the quote-unquote negative way. But when we are comparing to see progress and to notice what we can work on from a place of growth and confidence and optimism, then comparison is actually super helpful, not a thief at all. It's a source of joy. So I have got 3 ways that you might want to try to compare and be aware. The first way, compare yourself to yourself, your current self to your past self, to see your own progress. I love this method of comparing because I love seeing how far I've come, how much I've learned, and how much I've created. I love reading my old journal entries and noticing things that were a problem or a struggle for me in the past that are no big deal for me now. I told you how I make birthday lists each year, and I love to read through those to see what I've created over the years and what used to seem like a big goal that is now a completed accomplishment. I really like remembering back to when I was new at something and remembering how complicated I thought something was, and that now is easy and second nature for me. I struggled with something in the past, but now I can do it on autopilot. This kind of comparison and seeing my own progress gives me a feeling of pride. And you've heard the expression pride and joy, right? So you could say this is an example of when comparison is a source of pride and joy, or just comparison is a source of joy for short. Another helpful way to compare is to think about an expander. I talked a little about how I'm learning about expanders in the episode Practical Tips for Transformation. Basically, an expander is someone who's already doing what you want to do, someone who already has what you want. You can compare yourself to them to notice what they did at your stage. Figure out how they got from where you are now to where they are now, and then figure out how you can follow that path. I love noticing that someone who I identify with already has done what I want to do. That shows me that what I want to do is possible for someone like me. And that point of similarity, the way that I identify with them, it doesn't have to be major or meaningful. It can be the most simple, obvious similarity, and my brain will let me think that we're basically twins. And if she can do it, why can't I? This kind of comparison gives me a feeling of joyful optimism. So you could say this is an example of when comparison is a source of joyful optimism, or just comparison is a source of joy, for short. And finally, the third way to compare, to be aware, is by noticing what you can learn by paying attention to what is different. Remember the compare and contrast? The contrast part of the assignment is noticing differences, and I love noticing when people think differently from me and act differently than I do. I have a few friends who are the opposite of me, and I love hearing their take on what I'm thinking about or experiencing or going through, because they have a completely alternate perspective to what I think about it. And sometimes I don't even have to ask them. I can just imagine what they would think or what they would do in this situation that I found myself in, and that imagination exercise lets me think of an alternative way I wouldn't have naturally thought of on my own. By comparing how I think and do things to how other people think and do things differently from me, I learned so much. I learned that there is no one right way. I learned to experiment with ideas and processes that I wouldn't naturally come up with on my own. I expand my horizons and my experience. This kind of comparison brings out the joy of learning. So you could say this is an example of when comparison is a source of the joy of learning, or just comparison is a source of joy, for short. So what do you think? Is it possible, if done with awareness and intention, that comparison could be a source of joy for you? A way to feel proud? A chance to find hope? A path to growth and development? I think so. I'm excited to continue my own experimentation with this method of comparison, and I hope you will join me. Who do you want to compare yourself to now? What can you notice about yourself as you compare and contrast? Do you have any resistance to comparing yourself to yourself and to others? If so, what's the resistance? I want to hear all about what you're thinking now that you've listened to this theory. Send me an email at hi@bexb.org, or leave me a comment on the notes for this episode at bexb.org/compare. And if you are on my email list, you're one of my favorite people, so I have sent you a comparison worksheet for you to intentionally, purposefully compare yourself and hopefully find some joy in it. If you're not on my email list, make sure to join at bexb.org/favorites so you will always get notified whenever I post a new episode. Plus, you'll get the fun extras that I send out to my favorite people each week. And one more thing that I included on today's email is an invitation for you to share some questions or insights with me. In the month of October, one of my episodes is going to be a co-created episode, meaning I want to include thoughts and questions from listeners. Click on the link in your email If you want to share your insights and questions with me, and maybe I will include it in the episode that's coming up in October. And next week is the first week of October, so we will be talking about another one of my favorite teachers. Any guesses? I bet next week is not what you think at all. And I can't wait to share the surprise with you. So have a great week and talk to you next Friday. This has been Release Your Resistance. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, think about someone who you know who would love this episode and share it with them. There should be a share button on your app if you're listening to this on your phone. If you'd like to continue this conversation one-on-one or in real time, come visit me on my site at bexb.org to see how we can work together.